Okay, so this is the second video that I've made here for the course. And this time we're talking about science fiction definition. We're asking the question, what is science fiction? Before we study the genre, we should probably know what it is, what makes up science fiction, and what makes it different than other forms of literature. So let's start with the big picture. Science fiction itself is actually a subgenre of another genre of literature called speculative fiction. And speculative fiction also includes fantasy, it includes steampunk, it includes alternate history, which I guess steampunk kind of is. Science fiction's particular niche is that it combines both science and fiction. And I would say also that it also combines math. I don't know that there's something called math fiction, but if you're into that sort of thing, you'd probably find it under science fiction. So let's just talk about some of the subgenres of sci-fi and go through what makes them different, what makes them unique. So when most people think about science fiction, or maybe I should say the classical, the traditional idea of science fiction, is hard science fiction. It's fiction where the science or technology has a primary role. And that science or technology is usually related to physics, chemistry, astronomy, space travel, maybe robotics. Traditional science fiction is hard science fiction. So Arthur C. Clarke, the first story we're reading this week is 9 Billion Names of God. That's not really a traditional hard science fiction story, but Arthur C. Clarke wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, among other things, and those are hard science fiction stories. There's the character development, the story of the human person in the work, but there's also the science that takes a primary role as the author imagines or tries to figure out what future science might be like and how people might interact with it. I've heard the term soft science fiction or fantasy science fiction referred to, and that generally means science fiction where the science is not as outlined. You're not going to encounter theories of physics or speculative chemistry or something. I find that those science fiction novels tend to focus more maybe on social sciences. They ask, well, what is it like to have a government that we never had on Earth? Or what is it like to have relationships and cultural history that we can't replicate here? And how would people react to that? So Ursula Le Guin's famous Left Hand of Darkness is a good example of this type of science fiction. Though she has hard science fiction elements in this story too. In this book, a traveler from Earth visits a planet where there are no gender or sex separations. Each person has both genders or sexes within them, and she imagines what society would be like under those circumstances. A favorite genre of mine, and a lot of other people too, I think, is cyberpunk. Cyberpunk started with this novel right here, Neuromancer by William Gibson. Cyberpunk imagines computers, technology, and the intersection of those things with people, both socially and physiologically. You get things like androids and cyborgs, which of course they predate Neuromancer. You had Arthur C. Clarke writing about robots, and certainly even some of the earliest science fiction stories are about technology and computers gone bad. But there's a certain integration of punk or anarchist or culturally subversive elements in cyberpunk, where the characters aren't necessarily the good guys in the traditional sense. The other great thing about this particular book is that William Gibson predicted the internet in the early 1980s before it ever even happened, which is one of the other terrific things about science fiction, is that it is predictive. As people look at the world around them, as authors look at the world around them and ask what the ongoing improvements and changes in society and technology mean and what they'll bring about, they speculate about those things in their fiction, and sometimes it comes true. That's certainly true for Neuromancer and the Internet with William Gibson. Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein both had visions of the way that we would currently use satellites. Arthur C. Clarke ended up being more correct. We use satellites for communication, we use it for entertainment, we use them for global positioning. Robert Heinlein was an advisor to Ronald Reagan on the Star Wars program, and he envisioned satellites being used for military purposes, and they're used for military intelligence. So science fiction anticipates the future fairly well sometimes. Isaac Asimov is a very famous name within science fiction. He wrote the Foundation series, this is the third book in the Foundation series. I think there's at least one more after this. Interestingly, on a side note, the director of Interstellar, I haven't actually seen that yet, but I'm looking forward to watching it. He has a deal with HBO to make a Game of Thrones style series out of the Foundation series. So that's exciting. I might also call this, or some people call this, a space opera. Not in the sense that anyone is singing in Italian, but the scope, the epic scope of these novels. They cover millennium, they cover light years, they span galaxies. They are grand and perhaps operatic. And so even though this is in a lot of ways a hard science fiction novel, Asimov imagines the future of technology in these works, but the scope is quite broad, so we might call it space opera. Certainly Star Wars is an example of that. Dystopic novels, those are, or maybe we might say post-apocalyptic stories, are another popular or common genre of science fiction. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is sort of like a proto-cyberpunk novel, but it also imagines a world that is been changed for the worst by technology. As does Roadside Picnic, the longest work we're going to read together, by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. They imagine a world that's been changed either by nuclear war in one case, by changes in technology, by social upheaval. And so, maybe a more common idea of this might be something like Mad Max or Terminator, where a nuclear war has wiped out humanity. Sometimes zombies sort of overlap with this genre, so the zombie fantasy fiction genre and the science fiction sometimes overlap as people come up with science fiction explanations for zombies, and the post-apocalyptic genre takes over as people turn into zombies, and the survivors have to fight for their lives. The last genre that I would mention is what I'm going to call literary science fiction, and that's sort of a problematic term, I think, because there is a separation between literature with a big L and science fiction or other genre literatures, in that they don't get the same respect, or some novels, or most novels within the science fiction genre don't get the same respect from the literary critical and publishing communities that mainstream literary novels do. So people like Isaac Asimov and Ursula Le Guin and Arthur C. Clarke, who are all prolific writers with huge fan bases that have said profound things, don't quite get the same respect as someone like William Faulkner or Ernest Hemingway or Virginia Woolf. There are some exceptions, of course. We read Kurt Vonnegut, something like Slaughterhouse-Five. That's certainly literary fiction, and that's science fiction as well. Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, 1984, Brave New World. They're dystopic novels that have become literary fiction by virtue of being read a lot in high school, perhaps. I'm not sure if that's the real reason why. Thomas Pynchon's Gravity is Rainbow is a book that's criticized, that's thought of as a work of postmodern literary fiction, but it's also science fiction in a lot of ways. There's a giant octopus named Grigori that goes on the loose after someone, and he has a personality. So it's a small subplot in that novel, but it still is science fiction and literary fiction. But what I mean by literary science fiction might be something like Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. It's a classic work. Lots of people have read it. People analyze it and critique it. On another way of thinking about literary science fiction might be someone like Ted Chiang, who you could call magical realism, who is published and read by people outside of the science fiction fan base, outside of readers of the science fiction genre. And his language and style tend to be more like contemporary literary fiction. We're going to read the story of your life in this book, from this book. So I guess that gives sort of an overview of what science fiction is. And so for your assignment today, what I'd like you to do is go use some of the links that I provided, go online and use Google and other search methods, and also your own experience as a science fiction reader, film watcher, fan, or just person who's been exposed to it. And tell me, what is science fiction? Come up with a definition. I've given you sort of a general understanding of the way that a lot of people think about it, but I want to know how you specifically think about it. So go to the discussion board, open it up, read the instructions, and I look forward to reading your responses.